What should we read into last weekend's local body elections? To consider that question, I'm joined by MBR columnist Brigitte Morten. So was it a big swing to the right and the government should be worried about next year's general election?
I think generally there was a bit of a swing to the right when you look at some of the political affiliations of the candidates and what they were standing, the platforms that they were standing on. But I don't think you can really read into it too much. Firstly, I think you can probably say it's more of a change versus status quo election versus a left versus right. You see, particularly here in Wellington, for instance, Tory Whanau got up. She is definitely on the left. Former Chief of Staff for the Green Party. How do you sort of explain that if it was a massive across the country swing to the right?
And also the turnout, so low as to be questionable about what it might mean.
Yeah, I think that's one factor, but I think also people sometimes think that low turnout, somehow sort of diminishes the entire results of the election. But you've got to remember these people voted, but also they were motivated to vote as well. The people that stayed home, in some ways, for some of them, that is a vote in itself. Some people went, it's too hard, I don't care enough, I don't care about any of these candidates and things. So I think, when we've got an MMP election, that does rely on getting people out to vote. And it's looking like it's going to be close. So National and Labour particularly are going to be concerned with getting as many of their voters out. That type of lessons actually are really important.
I guess, though, if you look at Auckland, maybe there's a big lesson there for Labour in terms of obviously more centre-right voters got out and not many people in South Auckland did. So a challenge for Labour maybe to get its supporters out to vote next year who may be getting a little bit disenchanted with what's happening under this government?
Yeah, I don't think, once again, kind of going back to making sure that we're not completely doing it on left versus right. Obviously, the two front runners there were Efeso Collins, that was Labour, but Wayne Brown, picked up centre-right voters, but not necessarily, completely out any sort of national branding.
He could be as problematic for National as he could for Labour.
Exactly, and I think he ran on a really strong change mandate. It was really about actually kicking up what was happening in Auckland Council, sort of regardless of what that sort of outcome was. So I think you have to be a little bit careful there. Definitely there's geographical differences. I believe somewhat there was a stat that twice as many people or proportion voted in Devonport compared to Otara. So of course that for Labour, if that's where they think their main votes are, obviously they need to really get their ground game kicking up in those areas.
Were there any sort of background issues that came through though from the local body election that might have an impact on the general election?
I think generally the overall narrative of the fact that people were sort of generally sick of government, we've talked multiple times about how generally across the world you're seeing, people getting less trustworthy, less trusting and less, affiliated or concerned by the central government activity. So I think generally people, didn't really like what was happening with government at the moment, so that's why they went for a change. Then, of course, you had, particularly this election, a number of central government policies that were affecting local body elections, and, many councillors and candidates made promises that they couldn't keep around Three Waters and around housing intensification. And generally you had that sort of centralisation theme, I think, going on as well. We've seen the DHBs removed from regional control and the polytechs as well. So, out in those regions, they're feeling possibly a little bit disempowered as well.
But I guess, you mentioned Three Waters. We heard from a number of the opponents of the Three Waters reform process talking about how there was this massive sort of revolt against it. If that was the case, surely we would have had a bigger turnout at the local body elections. If ratepayers and voters were that concerned, wouldn't they have turned out in greater numbers?
Well, who's to say these voters didn't turn out? You can't tell based on the votes that we see what a percentage of those were motivated to turn out on basis of a single issue, say Three Waters, versus not turning out at all. So I think you have to be careful about reading too far into that. You've got a lot of candidates who ran on an anti-Three Waters platform who did get up, so you could probably say that there was a significant number that turned out, particularly if you compare it, say, to the other issue people were concerned about, which was around vaccine mandates and the number of people running on an anti-vaccine sort of freedom ticket. Not many of them got up, so clearly there wasn't much of a motivation for them to come out and get in the votes.
So, well, talking about the vaccines, I just wonder for those local government elections and for those councils and mayors who have been, whether they were disadvantaged by the fact that for much of the term that they'd been there, we'd had the COVID-19 pandemic, lockdowns, etc. do you think they got any of the sort of negative wash up from that?
Oh, I think without a doubt. I think definitely some of the incumbents were sort of put in that same sort of box as somebody that had been dealing with the sort of status quo around what was happening at an entire government level over the last couple of years. And councils did have very little power within the sort of COVID restrictions. I think mostly it came down to whether or not they were enforcing mandates to go into their local libraries or not. You know, it wasn't great that they had much power in that space. So, but without a doubt, I think that overall narrative probably did affect some of those incumbents. But then, you know, you've got some people that were, you know, massively, you know, supportive of those COVID outcomes. Once again, I turned to Tory whānau in Wellington, you know, that was a big proponent space. The Greens were very supportive of restrictions. And I think, you know, she won by a landslide.
I mean, looking ahead, what can be done for the next local body election to try and lift voter turnout?
So I think there's been a lot of discussion about online voting, but nobody's really come across a way that's going to be done that is secure. I think obviously we've had some issues around the different levels of service provision. You know, it's quite unusual. I think most people were surprised to learn that it's not run by the Electoral Commission. So you saw a lot of ballots not turning up, you know, including the Minister for Local Government, Nanai Mahuta, her ballot didn't turn up. So I think, you know, from that point of view, there's clearly got to be something that fixes the system there. Whether the postal system is up to continuing to be, you know, the place that most people can vote through, and also around special votes and whether or not, you know, there's enough booths open at the right times in the right places. I know for me, I had to do a special vote because of moving house. I pretty much had to go between the hours of 9 to 5 somewhere in my local neighbourhood far away from my office to try and do it. And, you know, I'm a political nerd, pretty motivated, but that was a pretty big barrier to actually voting.
Brigitte Morten, thank you for your time.
Thank you.